Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm going to see if I can get this high from me. You guys can lower it for yourselves. I'm sorry. Hi. I want to welcome everybody to the first climate lecture of 2026, which is kind of weird to say. This is a lecture that will be actually with 4 different folks, myself included as part of it. We also have a number of folks virtually online, so I want to thank everybody who's able to be here in person, and all the folks who are online currently, and all the people in the future where we've solved everything and figured everything out, hopefully. Oh, there we go. Good audio. So for folks in person, a couple of different things. Oh, here, actually, let me use the actual slides for the visual learners. So this is kind of our flow for today, doing welcomes and introductions. We have, again, 4 great speakers and stuff that'll be on with us today. I did get an update that Derek Pounds might not be able to join us in time, so we're going to be flexible with that, and we'll have more time for Q&A or a little bit of different discussions. I also want to give a quick thank you to folks on the team. Yeah! This is the team that makes a lot of our stuff possible. So we have Dr. Anthony Lavenda, who is currently online and such, I think working with the chat and stuff and folks. We have Gwendolyn, who's also online, and Emma, folks that you guys saw in person outside in the front. And then we have Marisa, who's actually in Mexico right now for her study abroad this quarter, doing really awesome work there. And we have Anijah and Ian, who are off campus today and such, but have been really great MES students that have been helping with our program. I also want to thank a few of the other folks, Thad Cruz, Kurtz, Ash Fansler, and Christine Ackley, as well as some of our advisory board members. In fact, Thad actually helped with some of our research for some of these later topic points. And there's tons of other folks we've had on the team that I want to thank. And thanks to all of you guys again for being here. So like I said, logistics and stuff. For the first 2 are only going to be relevant for you all that are here in person. Restrooms are down the hall to the left. There's also refreshments if you didn't see that. There's cookies, I believe gluten-free options and such, tea, coffee, and whatnot. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A that will allow for you guys to ask all of the participants that have been presenting here to talk about their questions. We'll have a little bit more time for the Q&A, so make sure to hold on to those and such, or if you want to try and ask midway through, they can kind of go with the flow. And lastly, I want to also thank the students of the Clean Energy Committee, as well as the staff on that. This was sponsored by them and was made possible by them, as well as all the food, so make sure to eat it. All right, so I'm going to give a brief introduction of some of our speakers in a moment. Here's kind of a little bit of a preview of the different folks we have today. So we have Sam Saltieland, Ross Cowman, Andy Gross, and Derek Pounds, who might be joining us online at some point. But kind of a brief anecdote to talk about why this ended up being the topic for the very first climate lecture series of 2026. This actually, funnily enough, started for me in high school, and then also here as an undergraduate at Evergreen. I was playing a game called Democracy 3, in which basically you play as the leader of the country and such. They've expanded to have tons of different countries. But it was actually the first time where I learned about public administration and policy, and then later on came to Evergreen to study public policy. But it was a great game. One of the things I learned from it was that I kept on trying to get rid of cars as a climate enthusiast and such. I was really aggressive with how I removed roads, accessibility, cars, and everything. And there's demographics, if you haven't played this game, where there's motorists, there's liberals and such, there's folks with different political backgrounds or different kind of demographics. The motorists in my first 8 runs would rise up and basically throw me out of the office, sometimes very violently. So I learned an important thing, that policy is not just about making policies proceed, but it's actually about people as well. And it's a lot about how they react to things. So that was a fun time. Then much later, when I was in college in my, I think, junior year, I did an ILC, which for folks who are not familiar with Evergreen is an independent learning contract. Basically, you get to design your own curriculum. And I was studying urban studies, as well as how do you build a sustainable city, looking at distributed grid systems, all these things. This is not a screenshot from my game. This is somebody who was much better at it. But the funny thing is about where I had a really good learning experience is that I read a lot of great texts and such, but the thing that I can remember now from almost 9 years ago in that ILC is the instance where I thought I was going to lose my credits because the people in my city were dying, and I did not know why. Not that I think I would have lost any credits from the faculty. EJ Zeta was really sweet and nice, but what was interesting is that in the game you can have multiple layers, and it's basically just GIS mapping, geographic information systems. But I was able to see that over time that there was the people that were being sick, that we were having to put more money into the healthcare system, that they were all on the same road basically and stuff, or kind of had the same line, which was really strange. And so I went through the different layers and stuff, looked at the water tables, the utility centers, and eventually figured out that they were all along the same water main. And so when I followed that water main back up to its source, I found out that I had made a mistake with my zoning code areas basically, and that there was an area that's supposed to be commercial, but it was instead industrial. So it was polluting the area around it and polluting the entire stream of water, causing everyone to be sick. So it was really interesting for me to figure out how GIS information could be used to solve things. There's a great text that I also read at the time called I believe it's Ghost Mapping with John Snow, who basically was one of the first folks to really work with GIS maps, or not electronically and such. But basically that really cemented my learning. So that's when I started realizing that, this video game actually really helped me take a lesson from it that I still remember almost a decade later. Earlier than that, in high school, I had a classmate who was super brilliant, but never got any of his homework done, and I was always confused by it. He read pretty much the entire Lord of the Rings series and stuff within a week almost. Was highly concerning. He did not sleep a lot and stuff, but he read it all. And the funny thing is, I was like, so cool. So did you read what was it? Oh my gosh, that book with Holden. I don't remember. It was something that everybody had to read at the time. Thank you. Yes, Catcher in the Rye. Thank you. And he's like, no. I'm like, what, dude? Like, we have to do a report on Friday and stuff. I also asked him if he had finished our chemistry homework, and he said no. But then unrelated, he showed me his stack of his character, Dungeons & Dragons character backstory, which was almost 20 pages. Our assignment for that chemistry history report was 3 pages. He had none of that done. I think he got like a paragraph. But he also created, and this is not his image, he created an entire alchemical system and stuff where he basically used real world history and stuff to build like this fantasy system. And I was like, dude, you could have just put this in your paper and been done with it and stuff. So this is when I kind of started slowly realizing that games have a certain power and an unnatural charm and hold over us, was kind of through these different experiences and such. And then it was through talking to some of our folks, either online, reading their works, or getting to guest lecture with them and stuff in classes, that I really started to see how there was an impact for this and how it might uniquely help with climate change and a lot of what are called wicked problems in the world. So kind of a side note is there's the question of when is a game not a game. This is a thing that we did in the Master's Public Administration program with Amy Gould, where basically you had to balance the federal budget. It's really weird to think that an Excel sheet and balancing budgets could be fun, but like we asked for like more time to do this and such. And again, that was just mostly as a simulation. There's other games too, such as Half-Earth Socialism, where it's very much similar to that Democracy 3. You can also get out of the office. It's happened to me a couple times. And basically you essentially kind of almost Pokemon card play these different skills in order to build a better future and such. And you have to balance things with biodiversity, carbon emissions and such, community aspects and such, including also like how is their politics system organized. So. But kind of going on to climate, and why is this tie into there, is that climate is complex, unfortunately, in that it is what's called sometimes a wicked problem. Wicked problems being ones that are not just able to be solved by technical solutions. You can't just engineer them away. You could say that for social justice rights around the world, indigenous climate rights, a number of different things, but it's not just one simple fix. It's part of a larger network and such. And unfortunately, human brains, we don't really like that. We've evolved for a long time with kind of things in front of us and such. Let's see. But there are certain instances that we kind of focus on and such and break the problem down. This is Quinault, a tribe local in Washington and such, that was looking at issues of what is rising sea level going to do with climate change. They were able to use advanced modeling to be able to see that a large section of their area was going to be flooded. So they had to figure out, cool, we need to start actively now planning decades in advance to move our infrastructure and such. So this is where we also have, there's a lot of games that actually also pair to this, looking at things like even Olympia. This is not about Olympia on this game here, but basically that help us kind of gamify and understand these as models and simulations where we can practice multiple versions of it and such to kind of get to what would be a good strategy to maybe implement. Last thing, this is also from Anthony and such, but this is kind of talking about how we look at climate and such, is that we talk about forecasting, where we look into the future, like with weathers. When we do backcasting, try and figure out how can we get to the ideal scenario. Very much like a chess game and such, but much like these strategy games and stuff, there are different patterns that you can look at and such. There are certain traits and things that we can name to help us break it down into complex ideas into more understandable chunks. And then when you zoom out and stuff, sometimes that allows you to see general patterns that allow you to actually solve very complex problems and such that also integrate human social behaviors. So I'm going to wrap this up, but why games, as kind of the topics and stuff, is that it helps us model and understand our reality. Climate is complex. That is from the United Nations, basically all things we would need to do to make a sustainable world. Games can be fun. That's the other thing too that's kind of obvious and such, but they are simulations that allow us to do it in a safe, fun, engaging manner and such. There's a great research paper about why games result in stickier learning, as they put it. In fact, we'll even share those ideas more readily and such. And lastly, we know that we need different ways of thinking, and that a lot of the things I think we can all kind of relate to the fact that we have a lot of systems and ideologies that are not really helping us right now with the world that we want to live in. This is also from the United Nations, which is about 5 traits that they think that folks need to do to be able to advance society in the next century and such into a space that we want to go in. So they allow us to train for social scenarios and build those skills. So I'm going to go ahead and pass over to our really cool folks and such. So I'm going to welcome Sam Saltieland. If folks can give me a round of applause. Okay. And do you want a mic to be able to walk around?
I have a limited number of hands. Here,
Okay.
that's the key problem.
All right. In that case, then you want to do this microphone.
Sure. I'm also realizing I was nervous about standing up here, and I just introduced Haley to two people who already know Haley. So this is my ritual public humiliation, which is the way that we should start all panels. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Saltieland. I'm a faculty here at Evergreen. I teach creative writing and game design. I'm also a professional game designer, and I'm the secretary of the education board for Washington's Tabletop Gaming Alliance. Michael did a really great job of going through why games, but I'm going to break down in more detail exactly how those things are functioning. So you set a good entry point for me. So to talk about why games can be relevant for climate justice, I want to talk about what is a game, right? So games in their loosest sense have been around in some form for pretty much forever. Board games date back to ancient Mesopotamia, but games in their truest core don't need cards, they don't need boards, they just need play, right? Play is an essential part of development that's not just for human children, but it's theorized that but it's also important for animals as well. You see animals in the wild playing around. And it's theorized that on a developmental level, that play takes on the role of ritual. So it's reinscribing social norms. Like if you think about kids playing house, right? They're modeling something that they've seen from oftentimes their parents or from other people around them, and they're giving themselves a chance to practice it, right? Or kittens pretending to hunt each other. Play can be a way of practicing behaviors that you then do for real. I tend to think of games with that framework in their absolute broadest definition as a short interval of time in which you voluntarily enter into altered logics in order to have some sort of interactive experience. So constrained, voluntary entry, that can get a little bit fuzzy sometimes depending on the type of game. Altered logics, alternate value system, and it's interactive, right? They're not always going to be like this high conceptual inscription of cultural behavior, right? But that's a way that we can understand this connection between games and the world outside. So in terms of what I mean by alternate logic system, because I think that's an abstract concept, I want us to think about hide and seek, right? We're entering into hide and seek, and for this brief duration of time, it's not the concerns that you would have in the rest of reality, right? Instead, you're prioritizing your ability to hide and your ability to seek. It is entering into this logic where those types of actions are prioritized, right? And so this is what I mean by alternate logics, right? There is a Dutch historian named Johan, I can never pronounce this name correctly, Huizinga, who mentions this idea of a magic circle, right? He says, all play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice are all in form and function playgrounds. Forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hollowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world dedicated to the performance of an act apart, right? So that's what this means, right? It's this, I drew this terrible diagram with the line being representative of reality. And it's you step into this magic circle briefly to enter into this space of play that is an alternate logic, right? So through this alternate logic, we're not there yet. Never mind. I didn't change slides. Don't worry about it. So every game through its alternate logic is prioritizing some sort of skill, knowledge, or belief system, because it's saying that this thing is what will allow you to play the game, because the game encourages the development of that thing, right? It's asking you to play around with choice and consequences. Great example is Lizzie Magi, who you may or may not know is the original creator of Monopoly. She initially made 2 versions of Monopoly. There was the Landlord's Game, which showed the negative aspect of private monopolies, right? And it was kind of a game that prioritized everyone working together. And then she made Monopoly to show how terrible it is living under private monopolies. The game was then stolen from her and distributed, and she barely got paid for it, and now we all live under the oppression of Monopoly that we have to play with our families, right? Right, this is kind of like, when we look at what Monopoly is demonstrating, it is kind of cutthroat, right? If we look at the logics through which it's operating, we can understand that it's saying like, oh, this is a world in which one person will rise and all other will fall, and that is the effect of private monopolies, right? So this is kind of how we sort of like embed ideas. We embed skills within games. So now we can move to this slide. So I'd love to hear kind of what skills, beliefs, or concepts do some of these games entail. I talked a little bit about Monopoly, but if we're familiar with Minecraft, Stardew Valley, Undertale, what are some thoughts? What do they prioritize? Michael?
Resource management?
Resource management, right? If we're talking, yeah, I didn't mean to choose so many resource management games. But right, if we're talking about games on like an educational perspective and we're looking at kind of what skills they might teach, Minecraft is a really excellent way to learn resource management. It's also a way to develop language acquisition. I have a friend with a kid who's about 6 years old, and it's not, oh, I'm going to learn how to read for the first time, but he's learning new words because he wants to understand how to play Minecraft, right? Yeah, what are some other beliefs, skills, concepts embedded in these games?
Kindness and empathy.
Stardew Valley, right? Yeah, it's putting this huge emphasis on community. It's saying that it is through community that you can kind of like share resources with each other. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
You can get anyone to date you if you give them the right kinds of gifts.
Yeah, that might be a problem. Right? If we look at the underlying logics and skills and concepts, we can kind of understand how games are putting them forward, sometimes purposefully, sometimes not purposefully, and sometimes for not the best purposes. So I put this up here not because in a like violent video games are causing crime to run, like that's not my pitch, right? That's not what I'm saying here. But Call of Duty is used as a recruitment method for the US military, right? And there's this really compelling essay written by Jamil Jan Kochai, who's this African-American writer, wherein he's talking about the experience of playing specifically Call of Duty, where you are fighting against Afghan insurrectionists. And he's talking about taking on this role of kind of like the assumed white male American soldier, and then looking at the insurrectionists who are like coded as the antagonists, and they're speaking Farsi. They're speaking the language that he recognizes. Their faces look like his and his family's, right? And feeling this dissonance with kind of this logic that this game is setting up, right? And so kind of this is a neutral power that games can have. It can be used for good, it can be used for not so good also. But we can start to understand like the role of games in education, right? You're entering into this magic circle of alternate logic, but it's not wholly detached. For better or for worse, you can take these cultural norms and ideas and you bring them into the magic circle and you play around with them. And it gives you a chance to experiment with them in a way that's lower stakes. And then you are the intermediary between the magic circle and real life. You bring back whatever you learned in the magic circle to real life. I'm realizing these arrows should point back to that straight line for this to be the more effective diagram, but you see what I mean, right? Like this magic circle is more permeable, right? It's a movement in and out of play such that you can learn in the process of games. And so to tie this back to climate justice, the overarching theme here, this means that games can be a really great educational tool. Typically, the classroom can be a super high stakes place where the pressure to produce something perfect, to get an A, that puts a lot of weight on learning, right? But within games, you can pick up skills and concepts in a lower stakes way, which makes it a good tool to teach people about climate change, because this is something that's like really heavy, right? It's not looking good. Climate scientists might agree. And so we're all like collectively have a lot of like emotional weight attached to this subject. And it can be really hard to engage with it. I think people can get really avoidant, but games can be used in order to teach, right? And so that's kind of the first element of why games are relevant and important for approaching climate justice. Furthermore, games are not just a tool for learning, but also for imaginative problem solving. And so I'm going to talk about like how people learn to so that I can explain what I mean by this. So kids learning in low stakes way. The sync between the voice and the slides not quite matched up. When kids, when they're like growing up and learning, they build from their frame of reference, right? So there are things that they don't automatically know. Most things, all things, they don't really automatically know. And they have this web of knowledge, and when they encounter a new piece of information, they're trying to understand how this information fits into their frame of reference. So as an example, a couple of years ago, I was doing a poet in residence thing at with fourth graders, where I was supposed to teach them poetry. Fourth graders did not want to learn how to write poetry, and so they were like trying to distract me a lot. And there was this one student who was like, "Oh, did the barber do that to your hair?" Which, as you can see, I have an undercut. And I was like, "No, my fiance and I shave each other's heads." And she looked at me blankly, and then processed through this information, and she said, "Did you shave your head because you're getting married?" And right, like when you think about it, like you can understand how she got there, right? She's seen haircuts before, and my haircut is weird. We're getting married around the same time that I have this haircut, and we cut each other's hair. So like maybe there's some like logical connection between these two things. You can see how she kind of like starts to understand that, right? And so this is like new information, the undercut. How do we integrate that into this web of knowledge? So as we grow up, our frame of reference expands, right? Now that I've explained this to the student, she knows that it's just another haircut that people have, but without explanation or introduction, there's not a point at which people automatically understand something beyond our frame of reference. So another example, has anyone visited the South and eaten alligator? Yeah. Okay. So, so if you haven't, right? And I'm like, imagine what alligator tastes like. That's like a void, right? You don't really have a great way of summoning up this idea. But if I say it tastes kind of like chicken, but with a saltier aftertaste of fish, you can kind of imagine that better, right? Because I'm connecting this unknown thing to something that you do know. So at any given point, we're existing in this web of understanding through our different reference points. This web is a tool for understanding the world, but it's also really limited. And we don't always understand that it's limited because it's invisible. We kind of take it for granted, right? It's that one fish says to the other fish, "Oh, the water's really cold today," and the other fish says, "What's water?" Right? That's kind of how our frame of reference operates. We don't even see it. So if that same kid grew up in a world where every single person that she has seen had an undercut, she wouldn't even know what a haircut is because there are no other options. Right? I have the same son who's learning about Minecraft. His parents are like very like punk, and they have a bunch of tattoos. And he, when he was starting to grow up, asked, "Well, when do my tattoos grow in?" Right? I'm like, this is a frame of reference. So this is kind of the problem when we're dealing with big societal issues like climate change. It's because so much of our frame of understanding is invisible to us. So we take a lot of assumptions for granted. We assume that something just has to be this way without even knowing that we're doing that. So if everyone in the world had this haircut, sorry for harping on this example, but I think, this is compelling storytelling, reiterating, right? Repetition. If everyone had this haircut and they were trying to solve the head too cold problem, right? We'd be like, okay, well, we gotta hold our hand over here when we go outside, or just hats, I guess. That would be a better solution, but this is goofier, right? But it would be well, this is of course the way that we do our hair, so there's not any, there's no option to throw it out. We're taking something as a given without even realizing that we're doing so. So that's the key issue, right? In solving societal problems, it's not the only issue, but it is a key one that we don't even realize that there are other options. So returning back to this idea of games having their own internal logic, when we get stuck in our own frameworks, we can step temporarily into a new framework through games. And this is not limited to games, right? This is through books, through movies. This is how we learn from the media around us, is that we get to step into these alternate worlds. And it's a way to step beyond our own limitations. Within that space, we have the opportunity to defamiliarize ourselves from our problems, examine our pre-existing assumptions, and explore new possible solutions. And again, we're not just stepping in and out. We go into these worlds and we're changed by them in a small way. We get to take that change with us when we leave. So games can be a really powerful tool for brainstorming our way past these limitations because they become more visible to us, or trying to change the place that we're starting from to look at possibilities that haven't even occurred to us, right? There's a 2007 game named World Without Oil that was designed by Ken Uckland, Jane McGonigal, and a bunch of other game designers. It was an online game that took place over the course of a couple of weeks. It started by describing the conditions of a realistic oil shock, and then it asked the players to imagine what their lives would be like under those conditions. And over the course of the few weeks, the players journaled about kind of what their lives would look like, not just in kind of a space of imagining as an educational tool, but also they interacted with each other and used the space to problem solve of okay, well, we're running on an oil shortage, so what do we do? How do we solve the infrastructural issues that are coming up, right? And as this was going on, the game developers released new narrative every single week that was in response to the players. It gives them this chance to play around with the choice and consequence in this way that allows them to innovate, to brainstorm solutions, right? And so this builds off of a foundation that is already commonplace when it comes to climate justice studies, right? You talk about simulations and modeling, right? I like this budgeting example of that budgeting in real life sucks, but there's something really interesting about doing it in kind of this lower stakes way that allows you to kind of play around, see what the consequences are, and have fun with it and innovate with it. So you can be okay, well, this isn't the situation I'm in. What if we start from a different place? What would that look like? How can we then try to work to this different starting place? It frees up the imagination. So the games are kind of a way to bring in the human element, right? It's using gamification as a tool to imagine a better future and bring it into reality. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to switch this over. I believe we'll have Andy. I think you are up next. Let's see. And clickers there if you want to use it. Would you prefer to be able to walk around or?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I can turn it on. If that'd be nice. All right. Oh, here, it takes a second. Testing. Oh. Yeah, let's try that one. All right. Let's see. I'll switch this.
I can just use that.
Okay, let's see. Let's do that.
Yeah.
All right, we'll stick with what's not broken. So, not that this is broken.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm Andy Gross, and I'm going to be discussing the topic of utopia, specifically in the context of why and how to add conflict to utopia. So, the background here is that I'm the lead developer for this game called Fully Automated, which is a pretty standard issue action-adventure tabletop role-playing game that happens to be set in a positive future. And the most common question that people ask is, where's the conflict in a utopia? Before we can answer this, we have to really step back and do some table setting, starting with why do we want to tell stories about problems in paradise? Well, For that, we have to also ask, why do we even want to tell stories in a utopia? And then, why do we want to add conflict to it? And for this, we should establish that a utopia is, historically, the term means no place. It's like heaven or the end of a rainbow. It's defined by its impossibility. It's usually used for a philosophical exercise. A more accurate term for a world that we want to really imagine in detail would be a utopia, which is the opposite of a dystopia. But this is not a feasible term, as you can imagine, because it's indistinguishable verbally from the other one. So I'm going to be using the term protopia. So the reason we want to tell stories in a protopia is that we need to create visions of what we actually want the world to look like. For this, I want to explain a concept called target fixation. Target fixation is an attentional phenomenon in which the focus a person places on an object they wish to avoid instead draws them towards it. It's usually applied for when people are trying to navigate hazards at high speeds. If you are kayaking and you see this patch of choppy water here, you don't want to go into it. But, and this is totally true, if you're looking at it, you are going to go right into it. Even if you're looking at it going, no, 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 no. Not there is not a place. Now, if you look at this picture on the other side, what's great about it is that this snowboarder is going down a slope that someone's already been down, and you can see some trails. If you just slightly blur your eyes and just imagine that you can't see the trail, this looks like a point of view right before someone is about to have a very terrible crash into a tree. But if you can see the trail, it's actually not scary at all. You know exactly where you need to go. That is the solution to target fixation. It's looking for an absence of the hazard. And I believe that we are all experiencing a society that is suffering from collective target fixation with dystopia. This is how we end up with what we've got. We've spent about 50 years imbibing warnings about corporate capitalism run amok, and all of these warnings have just brought us closer and closer and deeper into it. So that's why we need stories about utopia. That brings us, though, to the question, okay, but why do they need to be stories with conflict? And I think it's helpful to recognize that when we talk about conflict here, that doesn't necessarily need to be petty fights, it doesn't need to be violence, but it does describe danger, risk, challenge. We could tell stories without this. There are a lot of cozy games about this. But the first reason why I think we need it is that, simply put, it's fun. I happen to be very basic. I enjoy Star Trek, I like Spider-Man, I like Superman, and the thing is, not everything needs to be for everyone, but I think it's really important that we emphasize that if we're trying to introduce ideas into the mainstream of society, it's important that we don't just tell stories and create games that are aimed at people who already are, on board with these ideas. Spider-Man is an example I use because you can find within Spider-Man games, in particular, examples where the designers have, probably unintentionally, upheld the idea that Spider-Man's value to society is that he's a super cop who can arrest the criminals that are too bulletproof for the real cops to do so before they go to jail. And that's how he solves problems. But you can also find a lot of stories where Spider-Man is an alternative to carceral punishment, where Spider-Man is a force that diverts people from a lifetime in the criminal justice system. And so when we make games, making games that have conflict, that are exciting, like Star Trek, for instance, that's a way that we can appeal to a broad audience to tell these stories. Additionally, this is how we explore ideas. It's really important that we emphasize that the solutions to our problems are not going to be ones that we discover when we reach a better future. We will create the better future by discovering them and actualizing them. So we can't say, well, one day we'd like the world to be perfect. I can't wait to find out what the solutions to our wicked problems are. We actually do need to engage with them. And then lastly, I believe that people really need conflict in stories, in part because it's, we're skeptical. It makes them more believable to show how problems are solved. Otherwise, what you're doing is, trying to insist that people just believe in something that, sounds too good to be true, because it may be. Additionally, going back to the Call of Duty example, a lot of people dream of being heroes. They dream of valor, they dream of courage, they dream of solving problems through their cunning and their courage. And if we don't create stories where people do so without upholding like existing narratives of domination and, good versus ontological evil, we really don't leave them other options. And that's how people find, the appeal of entering law enforcement and, the military. We need to give people role models for what it looks like to be a hero in the world we want to live in. So then this brings it back to finally games. Is anyone here familiar with the Tetris effect? Okay, yeah. The Tetris effect is a psychological phenomenon in which someone who has applied intense focus to a game experiences a continued, unbidden exercise of the same mental processes after walking away from the game. This is essentially the unwilled exfiltration of the alternate values that Sam mentioned leaking out of the magic circle. And it's named because one of the most common and very easy to reproduce experiences is if you play Tetris, in a hard setting for like an hour or two, you'll find yourself looking at your environment and recognizing shapes and saying, like, looking at a skyline and saying, if I had a long piece, it could go right in there, right? This occurs in a lot of different formats. It can also occur in spatial experiences. If you've played, for instance, a lot of tactical shooters, you can look at an environment like this, and again, not in any way like judging people who play these games, you could say, that would be a great tactical position. Or if you're in a platformer, that would be an environment, I could get there if I use this feature, right? And this was actually what led me to make Fully Automated as a game. It was actually just something I was playing with friends, and I found that playing it caused me to look at the world differently. I would look at news and think, I wonder how this would play out if we were to do this in this game. And so that's why we want to have positive futures, we want to have problems in our positive futures, and we want to introduce people and immerse them in them, preferentially through games. So then that brings us to the question of how. Well, the second question people always ask after, where's the conflict in a utopia, is, how do you expect everyone to share and get along? It's too hard to believe. And the funny thing is, these questions answer each other. How do you expect, where's the conflict in a utopia? Getting billions of people to get along. How do you expect everyone to get along? Through constant, unrelenting, never-ending conflict negotiation. That's it. That's the solution to both. So how does this work in practice? Well, to paraphrase Carl Sagan, if you wish to make a story set in a protopia, you must first invent the universe. This is one of the biggest differences between a protopia and a classical utopia. The way I think of it, by the way, is that a protopia and a classical utopia are both subsets of utopia in much the same way that a post-apocalypse and a cyberpunk dystopia are both forms of dystopia but with different features. In a classical utopia, you're using it as a philosophical exercise, and so you just say, start with the assumption that everyone's happy and contented. Now we're going to, think about an idea. In a protopia, you can't do that. You absolutely do need to describe what is it that makes people happy. The good news is this gets much easier with practice. So the first thing, I'll go through 2 tips for imagining the setting. 1, start in a place you know and just try and make it a little better. Just look at your own world, your own town, your own city, wherever you come from, and just imagine if every time you looked at the news and were like, ugh, they won the election. That didn't happen. Extrapolate out 10 years where your political preferences are all put into effect. This will not create a perfect world, but this is the starting point for a protopia. And then explore, what does that environment look like? Secondly, imagine the privileges of wealth shared broadly. William Gibson famously said that the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. This is for good and for bad. In the same way that, the worst things that people experience are what's coming for all of us if things get worse, The best things can also be imagined for people. Now, hopefully we don't all need to engage in like conspicuous consumption, but if you imagine what it's like to be a trust fund kid, to wake up in the morning and to say, do I feel like going to work today? Or, you know what, I want to do this thing, I'm going to start a business because this is a thing I'm passionate about, instead of like, I have to sell my labor to someone to pay rent. That's basically the kind of I think the building blocks of really strong protopia. So once you have this environment, now we're going to get to imagining conflicts. Went ahead one. The first thing I'll suggest, and this is how I got started, and it's amazing how effective this is just imagine a cyberpunk story, but assume accountability and justice. It's such a common feature, perhaps the defining feature of a cyberpunk dystopia is nihilism. It's the hopelessness. It's the assumption that when terrible things happen, you're like, well, that's how the world works. If you just take any if you're playing any cyberpunk game with friends and you just assume that when your characters reveal what this corporation is doing, obviously all the people in charge are going to jail and that corporation is going to get disbanded because no one would tolerate this, then all of a sudden it becomes protopian remarkably fast, even if the world is still in the midst of climate catastrophe, right? Secondly, think of the dissidents. Start with the exercise I described where you're trying to make a world according to your own understanding of what you would like to see it. And then think of all the people who are going to be really pissed off. That can be both people who are regressive in a sense, like people who are like, no, I liked it better when the world was uneven. But it can also be people who are your ideological allies who just don't agree with the execution or don't think it's gone far enough, fast enough. So I'm going to take a minute to let everyone enjoy this meme. It's a favorite of mine. Third, consider temptations. This is really important because we're so used to the problems that we have that we oftentimes forget that it's possible to have problems outside of our existing economic system. And I heard someone once say that in some ways, Solarpunk is the pursuit of better problems. So just create that world, and then you can create characters in it and imagine what would lead someone, especially someone with some degree of influence, to just do something they're not supposed to do. And it turns out this is, again, very easy. And then lastly, you can add in all the non-human problems, especially if you're imagining a future and you want to explore concepts of climate disruption. You can assume that okay, we're all now working with the best intentions and we're well-resourced and we're not wasting our time, fighting amongst ourselves. We're now going to have to deal with all of the problems caused by climate breakdown, right? And this creates, again, so many opportunities to imagine both a better future and reconciling how we deal with the problems that we're facing. And it turns out that the problems are coming. If we imagine them and play games where we're solving them in a better future, that's how you actually, again, overcome the target fixation issue. So this takes us to the conclusions. Immersing people in a desirable future bolsters their ability to articulate what they want to resolve to realize it. Stories of risk and heroism in protopias entice audiences to enter them, to explore solutions to problems that must be overcome to progress, and reassure people that a better future is not lacking in stimulation and opportunities for purpose. So we need to make imagining positive futures commonplace in our media. We need to allow it to be messy and believable. A lot of people, I think, are afraid that if they show the problems in their, better world, that it'll undermine it. No. If you tell a story about a better world and then it turns out that the president is corrupt and goes to jail, you didn't undermine your better future, you validated it. And we need to invite people to find thrill and excitement and purpose in all of this. So, as we close out, don't be afraid to actually propose solutions to problems. And don't be afraid of people pointing out where they fall short. That's the point. Thank you.
So we're going to hold questions and then do that at the panel. Is that right?
Unless anybody has burning questions, yes, yeah.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask before the panel?
Save it for the end. All right.
Oh, thanks. So we said these mics don't work after.
Oh, we can, yeah.
By the
No,
podium?
you can totally, I believe you get them turned on.
Okay.
There you go. Testing, testing.
And I need to use the mic because for the people online.
Yeah, I think that will
Okay.
help quite a bit and stuff.
All right, sounds great. Hi, everybody. Hello.
All right.
Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Ross Cowman. I'm a game designer, president of the Tabletop Game Alliance of Washington State, Evergreen alum. Woo! Go Ducks. Dig deep. Okay, so Washington State is pretty cool. I grew up here. I was born here. My family's from here, from this area. And as you know, we are if we're kind of tend to be indoor kids, especially in Western Washington. And I think that combined with the fact that Washington's got some of the highest college-educated percentage of the population of anywhere in the U.S. We got a bunch of nerds. We got the tech industry. We're a little nerdy here, and it may or may not come as a surprise to you that Washington is also the capital of the games industry, for especially the tabletop game industry for the entire world, and it's not even particularly close. California has more specific games tech over there, but the tabletop industry is mostly right here in Washington State, And the gaming industry in general, if we're thinking about its size, consider this. It's bigger than the movie industry, which in 2025 was valued at about $28.6 billion. It's bigger than the music industry, which was valued recently at $37.9 billion. It's actually bigger than both industries combined. Right now, it's valued at about $184 billion. It's a lot of money. Also, a lot of times when people are talking about industry, they really focus, they kind of hyperfixate on the financial aspect of it. That's just one way of measuring an industry. I think it's also, there's this other part, which is the cultural, the societal impact of games. And the money is a useful indicator of that. It's like what people are actually spending. It's like you spend something at the grocery store, it's because people are valuing it. People value certain kinds of foods. And people really value games a lot. And I think that one thing that we're seeing right now is the real birth in real time of this new vital form of media that people are really drawn to. And I think it's because, one, it's really taking a lot of things that we've learned from other forms of media and it's kind of wrapping them all together. And the Evergreen State College, honestly, is, I think, really well positioned to be a center of games education. One, because it's located in Washington State, and two, because since the 70s, it's had this, what is now really in vogue, this interdisciplinary learning model. And games are nothing if not interdisciplinary. So, those stats, by the way, come from Dentsu, their Japanese ad agency that was in their 2024 State of Games report. So I didn't just make that up. I looked it up. So Washington's special. In that. We have this concentration of talent. And you're going to hear me mostly talking about tabletop games, is what I'm passionate about. I love playing video games. I've clocked crazy amounts of hours in Slay the Spire. But I really, tabletop games are my passion, and I think that I hope for a future where we're not looking at screens all the time. And I know that a lot of other people feel the same way. I know that with all the wonderful benefits of technology, that is like one of the challenges that we have. And I think, we all saw this during the pandemic, how much we were just like, got nothing to do except like watch infinite Netflix and infinite Zoom calls and like even playing tabletop games online with other people. It's really cool, but after a while, you start to miss other folks, and you start to feel your soul slowly leaving your body. And it's really the antidote to that is actually just sitting down at a table with people, sharing space, sharing conversation, having these like shared emotional responses, these shared emotional experiences. That's why people go to church. It's why people go to rock shows. It's why people, I don't know, why you go to seminar. I don't know, maybe not why you go to seminar. I didn't always do my reading. So the Tabletop Game Alliance is it's a trade organization. I started it with about 20 other folks in the industry, kind of across a broad span of the industry. And what I want to do now is just kind of paint a picture for you of what I'm talking about when I talk about the games industry. And even if you're not interested in capitalism, you think capitalism's evil, I get it. Even if you're not interested at all in like starting a business, I think it's still important to understand where the money is and how the business operates, because that's one of the big tools that we have to affect change in this world is through private enterprise and public enterprise and partnerships between private and public enterprise. That's actually like a lot of the same things that are really causing harm in the world are like these really harmful systems. And I think there's actually like a lot that we can do through games, through business, through public-private partnerships to enact change. So the Tabletop Game Alliance was formed about 3 years ago, and it was formed kind of at the gentle and not so gentle prodding of the Secretary of State's office in Washington State. So if you don't know, our Secretary of State, Steve Hobbs, huge nerd, lifetime D&D player, and about like 7 years ago, when he was still a representative and hadn't been elected Secretary of State yet, or appointed Secretary of State yet, this law came across his desk. And I'm sorry, it was not a law that came across his desk. This complaint, someone called him up, and he was the owner of Around the Table Games, which is the local, I believe Secretary Hobbs is from Lakewood, and it was the local game pub over there. And the owner was like, hey, Steve, I just got this bill for like $20,000 from Washington State because they say I'm having game tournaments, of course referring to Magic the Gathering game tournaments, and Secretary Hobbs, or at the time Representative Hobbs, was like, oh, that can't be right. And so he looks it up and finds that there's this bill that's come through recently designed to regulate golfing tournaments that's being applied now to like anything that seems like a game tournament. And at this time, really, like most people, I think like looking around, most people in this room kind of understand, what games are. Our state representatives, our lawmakers, you say the word gaming, they're thinking like mostly tribal gaming, they're like casinos, they're thinking like golf tournaments, just like they don't really actually have a concept of what games are, especially in Washington State. And so they, through some efforts that sort of, they eventually were able to like communicate why this law was harmful and how it was going to shut down small game shops, and they got the law changed. And it sort of made them realize that, hey, you know what, in Washington, a lot of our lawmakers don't actually have any idea of like how special this place is and the special role that games and gaming have in the culture of our state. And so he started having these legislative game nights. I'm going to one next month where we actually will go up to the Capitol. They serve a bunch of Maconi subs. Yeah, they're all right. And we sit around and we play role-playing games, and you get to hear Steve Hobbs with all of his pan-European accents busted out. He's pretending to be goblin and stuff. And people are having a really good time and just actually getting to see games here in Washington State. And so the trade organization is here to be a place to kind of like serve as a voice for tabletop games in Washington, and also be a place to have these kinds of important conversations, to actually get people in these different aspects of the industry talking to each other and figuring out, what are the problems that we face and how can we work towards common solutions. It's also one of the goals of the tabletop industry is to help support people at all levels of enterprise, from like a hobbyist, from someone that is, maybe I want to get involved with this someday, maybe I want to start like a club at my school, or maybe I want to start a club at my local library, to some of the largest companies in the world, and we're trying to like form spaces to have conversation and dialogue between all of those, and help. And because it's all important, like those really large companies, like for instance, Wizards of the Coast, which is the publisher of Dungeons and Dragons, Magic the Gathering, was built off the backs of an invention by Richard Garfield when he was a professor, a mathematics professor at Western up in Bellingham. He was just a hobbyist. He was just like photocopying and making stuff. He invented Magic the Gathering, which turned Wizards of the Coast into one of the fastest growing companies in the world, which then eventually got sold to Hasbro and now employs I believe over 1,000 people in Renton, and earned like $1 billion. Like they posted like $1 billion in earnings like a year ago. So when I'm talking about tabletop games, these are the kind of sectors that I'm sort of talking about. So I'm going to go over creative professionals, retail and distribution, education and nonprofit, conventions and events, like people that organize those things, publishers, and then large enterprise. So for creative professionals, that is folks that are like designers, illustrators, writers, educators, journalists, people that have a blog, people that do game reviews. Those are all roles that are very much in demand in the tabletop industry. You'll see people that do freelancing, people that are illustrators, that can get work. There's a lot of like writing jobs in the tabletop industry. One thing that a lot of folks, when they think about the games industry, the first thing they think about is, oh, I want to be a game designer. And there is definitely work in the games industry for game designers, but there is not generally entry-level work at large corporations as a game designer. It's very unusual to, like Wizards of the Coast has, like 5 people that are like lead designers on Dungeons and Dragons, and most of them have been working in the industry for a really long time. So the entry-level positions for writers, if you want to be a game designer, is usually either self-publishing. So you come up with a game idea, you come up with some prototypes, either do like a zine version of it, or if you're doing like a board game, you could come up with a prototype and eventually like kind of pitch it, use crowdfunding. That's how my company got started, was through crowdfunding. Do like a Kickstarter or a backer kit or something and raise money and kind of put something out that way. For illustrators, the career path is actually sometimes a little easier. There's like a ton of demand for art in the games industry. For example, Wizards of the Coast in 2024 released the equivalent of like 5 unique Magic cards every single day of the year. Like each one of those cards had like different art on it. They like buy a crazy amount of art. And a lot of the especially role-playing game products that you see, board game products that you see, they hire a ton of artists. The pathways into those kinds of careers has to do with sort of developing online portfolios. I'll go into a little more into that, like networking, things like that. But also other things that people overlook are like editors, copywriters, people that are able to like, hey, I'm making a game about this particular topic. I'm looking for subject matter experts that can write lore and, come up, they're trying to fill up this 300-page book with a bunch of stuff. So, and usually those tasks will get split up amongst a bunch of different writers. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about creative professionals. So it's usually freelancers or people that have jobs working at other like large companies. That sort of envelops that. Retail and distribution is a really big part of the industry. So retail, we're talking about everything from retail locations like Olympic Cards and Comics, a lot of you are familiar with. Largest game store, largest hobby game store on the West Coast by square footage. And Gabby, these retail stores like Olympic Cards and Comics provide vital third places for people that are looking for community. Especially, they tend not to be alcohol focused, and they're places where family, like parents, are comfortable dropping off their kids to like hang out and play a Pokemon tournament or play board games with their friends. Gabby in particular, I know the city of Lacey has seen a decline since she opened up her shop in crime in that area. And they also provide many valuable services to unhoused youth, queer youth, people that maybe don't have a safe place to go The Gabby's Kids program has delivered foods and lunches and clothes, and done a lot of important giving. Game cafes are another thing to consider. So in Washington has seen some of the first game cafes where people can kind of like hang out and get food or have a beer, but then they'll have like a retail store. They kind of cater to you to just sort of hang out with your friends for several hours and play games together. For Mox Boarding House, there's Mox is a big one. They're funded by Card Kingdom, who's the largest distributor of the secondary market of Magic cards in the world. So like that's basically when you sell singles. So if you can go online and buy singles, and so they took a lot of the profits from that and they used it to invest in these retail stores, which are hugely successful. They're gorgeous. They're really nice. I think they really kind of push back against some of the old stereotypes that people had of gaming spaces in the '90s, where they're fancy. They're places where you can have a business meeting if you want. I actually saw like when I was there, like Meta was having a corporate meeting. Like they rented out the room for a Meta corporate meeting, which is like, all right, whatever, guys. But anyhow. And then you'll see some of these smaller shops like that are really TCG focused, like trading card game focused, like Pokemon, Magic the Gathering. That is a huge cash cow for a lot of these retail stores, is these kind of like game card tournaments. And some business models you'll see are these kind of smaller stores where they're really kind of focused on that specific element. That's retail. And then when I'm talking about distribution, this tends to be larger enterprise, though there are small indie distributors. My company is like a small indie distributor. Distributors are people that develop relationships with lots of different publishers and get their games sent to them. You either purchase them outright, or often at times it's on consignment. So you're like, hey, you 10 designers, I really like your games. Why don't y'all send it to me? I'm going to have an online store, make them available for sale, handle all of the shipping, handle all the order fulfillment and the customer service. And it'll also be like a one-stop shop where retail stores can come and purchase those games. Because retail store game buyers don't usually want to go and buy games from a bunch of individual retailers or publishing companies. They usually want to just go to one place, like a distributor. A lot of times if you go to a store and are like, hey, will you buy my game? They'll oftentimes tell you no, we only buy things that are in distribution. So there's a few really large distributors in the United States. One of the largest ones, I'm going to forget the acronym. It's like GTA GT something, GTS. They're based in Washington State, and they're one of the largest distributors is here. Also, my company, Heart of the Deernicorn, we're one of the larger distributors of specifically independent role-playing games. That's kind of our focus, story games. We're based here in downtown Olympia. So that's retail and distribution. Education and nonprofit. So this has to do with teachers, librarians, therapists, folks that are using games outside of a commercial context or in a nonprofit context. So you have Lila Ross, who is the chair of our education nonprofit board at the TGA, has a company called Gamers Engaged, and they specifically work with Wizards of the Coast, Mox Boarding House, and other companies to help them in philanthropic efforts. So Wizards, as you might imagine, produces like a ton of, when I say Wizards, I'm talking about Wizards of the Coast. Sorry, some people, I'm not just like Wizards, Yeah, but as you might imagine, they produce a ton of extra cards every year that they don't really know what to do with. And what Lila's, what did I just say their name was? Gamers Engaged. What Gamers Engaged does is they'll actually be a place where they'll receive pallets of these extra cards, and they'll repackage them together and donate them to schools for after-school programs. They also have a contest each year, a tournament called the Gauntlet, where they get it's a charity drive where they get a bunch of the publishing companies and different game companies in the video game and the tabletop industry in Washington to field teams that'll play in a series of tournaments, and all the money that's raised goes to charity. You also have folks that are using games in a therapeutic setting. So one thing that happened. Unfortunately, because of all the cuts in funding to the libraries, this program got shut down. But they had successfully started running games in juvenile detention facilities like Dungeons and Dragons, and there was another nonprofit, I believe Games to Grow, was doing that program. So it's another thing we're seeing. Also, Tony Brave, who used to teach at this college, is using games in tribal governance education. He wrote a LARP called, I believe it's called Coyote Country, where these different groups of students will each take on the role of different reservations that are bordering each other, and have to wrestle with like real world conflicts that can happen between reservations around like mineral rights and mineral exploitation, and different kinds of political things that they'll have to deal with. And he's been using that with youth like very, very successfully. Another game I think is really cool, kind of in the educational world, is Jason Morningstar's Winterhorn, which is it's what's called a committee LARP. It's a LARP, but it's really about a group of people that are all talking and trying to solve some kind of problem. The problem we're trying to solve is we're trying to break up this activist organization called Winterhorn, and we're basically using tactics that are actual tactics that the FBI uses still to this day to break up activist organizations. So like, getting people to like join the organization and just derail the conversation all the time, actually like, vandalism, things like that. So it's just a commit. We're just talking about it and talking about what we're going to do to these like poor people. And then like kind of every round we're deciding on what our tactics are. And he's actually designed this as a way for activist organizations to kind of understand these strategies and harden themselves against this kind of disruption. Education, nonprofit. Conventions, communities. So our conventions and our community organizers are a real vital part of the industry. So here in Washington State, we've got one of the largest game conventions on the West Coast, PAX, Penny Arcade Expo, which attracts over 100,000 people at the Washington State Convention Center, or no, the Seattle, what is it? The Washington Convention Center? That's the one in Seattle? The big one. Yeah, that one. PAX Unplugged happens in Philadelphia, run by the same organization. Gen Con, which is the largest tabletop convention specifically in the United States, is actually owned by a Washington company, so it's locally owned. And then in Washington, we've got probably over 20 kind of mid-sized to small game conferences that happen throughout the year. There's Unpub. Unpub happens at PAX. There's Orca, Dragon Con, Go Play Northwest, Playtest Northwest. And then there's a lot of small kind of casual meetups that happen too. These are really important. Like in Olympia, for a long time on Thursdays, we had like a Story Games Olympia meetup where we'd hang out and play GM-less role-playing games. And we're actually starting that up starting in February on Mondays at Altitude 15 downtown. So stop on by, 5 o'clock. Publishers. It's funny, I was writing my notes, actually, I'm missing one I forgot. I'm a game publisher. I forgot to talk about us, what we do. So publishing, funny enough, this is actually one thing that is really, I think both this and like convention organizing and event organizing are really easy entry-level ways to like get into games. Because anybody can call a bunch of friends and invite them over to come do something. Anybody can start a critique group of folks. Anybody can contact their local library or some bar somewhere and start putting on an event and kind of grow from there. Publishing also was my entry point into the games industry. I started by designing my own stuff, and then I was like, okay, cool. Now I'm going to figure out how to like put it out there. And before you know it, you run a Kickstarter, and a lot of people don't kind of become a publisher on accident because they want to be a game designer and they want to have creative control over what it is that they're making. So publishing just refers to all the stuff that you have to do to put that game out into the world to make it exist. So there's marketing, there's game design, there's product design, and there's just kind of the project management of that whole process is publishing. In Washington State, like just in King County, there's about 200 different publishing companies that are located in that area. I know of several people that do publishing, in Thurston County. So there's a few folks down here as well. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about publishers. Also, one thing I want to mention with publishing is that there is kind of this break that you see where you have folks that are kind of just publishing their own stuff, and I tend to lump those people more with creative professionals. They think they have more in common with like freelancers in terms of what their needs are and the kinds of challenges they face. Really, what I think steps you into being a publisher is as like your primary activity is when you start publishing work by other people and when you start hiring employees. That's when you start having to deal with payroll, having to deal with all this small business kind of stuff. You see a lot of publishers that only use freelancers, and there's only kind of like one person that's working there. It's just like a sole proprietorship. And then it's definitely kind of like another level of enterprise when you're like, okay, now I actually have to hire people. Now, I'm not the person that's designing every single game anymore. And the last thing I want to talk about is large enterprise. So in Washington, we've got some of the largest tabletop companies in the world. Wizards of the Coast has over 1,000 employees. Also, Pokemon International is here, and we have more. And they have about 1,200 employees, and there's actually more Pokemon employees in Washington State than there are in Japan. So, and Pokemon is actually a huge deal. It's something. I think it's the one study I was looking at said it was the 5th most valuable intellectual property in the world right now. But I do know that Pokemon International earned $12 billion in 2024. The Star Wars film franchise has earned $10 billion in its entire lifetime. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the scale of value of how many people are trying to catch them all. There's a lot of folks. Also, Ravensburger which is like kind of the old granddaddy of board game companies from Europe. Ravensburger USA is right here in Washington as well. And that's like an important part of the ecosystem, not just because of their employees, but just the massive amount of ex-employees that these companies all have. Wizards, laid off a few hundred, several hundred employees a couple years ago, and a bunch of them went to Ravensburger. A bunch of them started other companies, and it's actually like there's many companies in Washington which have there's kind of a joke, like everybody's worked for Wizards at one point in time. I actually used to be a pizza cook for Wizards of the Coast when I was in college. They used to have a restaurant on the Ave in the U District. But that was the first time I met the owner, Peter Atkinson. Was like I was making pizzas for like a corporate party that was being held. The second time I met him, I was up for the Deanna Jones Award, and he was like, "Oh, congratulations on the nomination!" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I used to make pizzas for you." He's like, "Oh, weird." Yeah. Anyhow, Peter. What else do I want to talk about here? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before we turn it over to questions. Oh, there's 2 more things I want to talk about. One is I want to talk about policy, just some of the activities of the Tabletop Game Alliance and what it is that we're doing. So the first thing is I mentioned the legislative game nights. Another one is we're hosting a summit here in Olympia on March 14th. Whoa. If you haven't seen that yet. This is a little different than a conference because this is really like industry focused. It's not so much a place to come and play games, so you can definitely demo stuff. This is trying to create space for if you're an illustrator, if you're a game designer, if you're looking to get into the industry to make it so you can buy a table and just kind of set up your stuff, and we'll have a little expo hall. It's going to be in the Olympia Center downtown. And people can just kind of like hang out and see what you're doing. And we're going to have like talks and seminars, cool seminars. No, what happens at Evergreen? No, Evergreen seminars are great. We're going to have seminar discussions and panel discussions, all kind of about the tabletop industry. So folks that are involved in all those different sectors that I talked about are all going to be converging on Olympia. And we'll be inviting lawmakers and other folks as just a kind of place to sort of showcase, like, hey, this is what's going on in the industry. And this is an annual thing. This is our 3rd year doing it. It's our 1st year kind of doing it at this scale. We go on trade missions. The TGA, a year and a half ago, I joined the TGA's trade mission to Japan. We went to Tokyo Game Market. I got to meet Tadashi Iwane, who's the mayor of Kato, which is our sister city in Japan. He gave me a bottle of sake, and it was cool. But it's also the international trade part's actually like a really important part of industry as well. Those sorts of cultural exchanges are not just important to to the industry, but it's also important to world peace. There's like that saying that like no two countries with the McDonald's have ever been at war with each other. I don't think that's true anymore. But I do believe that these kinds of, not only do games kind of bring together, but actually like doing business across cultural divides, both bring peoples closer together and help us understand each other. And it was a really powerful experience for everybody that went. Opportunities to exchange game culture. We're at time. Okay. Well, great. I'll end there. I'll end right there. Thank you so much.
So, in interest of time, I'd like to invite our speakers up here. We're going to do rapid fire questions. So if you have some questions, okay, good. We got somebody already. Feel free to get yourself situated here. I'm going to grab this tall chair, so I'm going to be even taller than everyone else. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to grab this one. All right. I think I saw a hand over there. Do you mind?
Yeah, I was trying to get it down, and we'll see how well I can get through it. But I'm particularly interested in the concept of pursuing better problems because it articulates something that I found missing in a lot of games that I've played and created. But as I was sitting here, one of the games I'm working on is in a historical setting. And so I wanted to ask you about any thoughts you have on creating better problems in history. Like magical realism, things like that are set in historical periods.
Sure. I have two tips. The first is, if you go looking in history, oftentimes you can find things that were better than what we were told about. Our history is presented in a, as it said, it's written by the winners. And for instance, there's a book called Less is More by Jason Hickel. And it's about the concept of deep growth, but it was surprising to me that it was less about like, here's a roadmap for how countries should pursue this concept of deep growth. It was more about a reflection on like, how did the commons get enclosed in Europe? And so reading this, I was like, shocked to discover that there was a time in the past where, for instance, land was like commonly held in that way. Especially if you're making a game, you aren't beholden to strict factual accuracy. You can go and find the coolest, weirdest thing that happened because people have been breaking free from the norm and doing like breakaway communist experiments throughout all of history. You can find those and say, I'm going to make more of these. I'm going to make this the central location. You can also just take one's ideas that were never realized and take, utopian fantasies from, the medieval era and use those as a setting in the medieval era.
I'd also recommend taking a look at Chris Spivey's Haunted West, which is a tabletop role-playing game that is kind of set in this weird West setting where essentially the premise is that the Reconstruction era went more successfully. And it's kind of a game told from the perspectives of a lot of people who are oftentimes on the outskirts or villainized within Western stories. Or another good reference point would be a book by River Solomon called The Deep, which is sort of like a magical realism fantasy book, that there's this underwater civilization of people that are descended from the pregnant mothers that were thrown overboard slave ships, right? And I point you towards both of these because I think that they're really excellent examples of using fantasy, using magic as a way to kind of not erase, not say that it didn't happen, but look at the trauma of, I think in both of these cases, specifically slavery, and be like, okay, well, how, within the context of that trauma, not saying it didn't happen, but how can we look at a different future? Or how can we use this past to then understand a different future? Because when we look at like the origins of magical realism, it's oftentimes about like the absurdity of living under trauma and living under colonialism, right? And while these are like specific examples for specific communities, I think kind of taking that logic can be a really useful approach for writing these sort of like historical fantastical settings.
I wanted to just invite each of you to shout out a game that deals with climate change or sustainability. Mine is Troubled Lands.
Ooh, that's a good one.
spitball ideas?
Mine was World Without Oil, but that's technically unplayable because it was a brief event that took place in 2007. Spirit Island would probably be my actual playable game as a board game. It's excellent. It's a little complex, but it's very, very cool.
I wish I had more like top of mind, but I think because you shared a slide with Half Earth Socialism, that's the one that comes first. It's like a free-to-play online game, and it's nifty, especially even if you get really frustrated with it. It's not like a super well designed for user interface. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'd have to think about it some more. I'm not sure I'd have a good recommendation off the hat.
I'll also mention Daybreak is a really great one. How many folks have played? Oh, thank you. How many folks have played Pandemic or heard of the board game Pandemic? The same creator also created Daybreak, which I think is kind of currently probably the best comprehensive view of climate change and understanding it and such currently. Yeah. And I'll show later, but we actually have a list of I think over 180 games that are climate or sustainability related. So, any other questions?
So for people who didn't grow up with games or grow up with tabletop games, but are interested in making and joining communities, but because maybe they grew up in a place where they didn't have access to those, so they're just beginners. How do you recommend they get into the space? Because people can tend to be protective of spaces, especially if historically maybe they were bullied for being called nerds, and they want to protect their spaces. But then, how do they protect? How do you, as someone who is new to those spaces, find your way there?
You're in the right place. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what the TGA is here for. And in general, just go to game conferences, go to game conventions. We have a whole calendar of all the ones that are coming up on the TGA website. Every first Wednesday at the Mystic is Industry Night at 6:30. They're 6 to 9, and Enterprise for Equity co-sponsors that with us, and they're specifically are very skilled at supporting entrepreneurs. So Erica's there. They bring snacks, which is awesome, and it's just a bunch of people that are brand new to the scene trying to get in. One thing that's great about trying to get into tabletop games is that it's an inherently social activity, and people are always looking for new players and new folks, and so that's one element. Just playing games, attending events, going to conferences, it's really about networking. And you're in a place where there's a lot of that. There's actually an abundance of that going on. So just show up, get to know people.
Speaking of events.
Look at all this stuff. I think this is a huge problem, and I'm saying this to you. Claire's been in 5 of my classes. I think this is a huge problem, right? There's a long history of sexism, racism within the gaming industry, and games can be so complex that they oftentimes require someone to show you how to play them. And when a lot of the potential mentors within these spaces are alienating to people from marginalized backgrounds, it makes it really hard to get into it as a hobby. And I think part of in terms of just how to get into even playing games, a lot of what I can recommend is looking at simpler games. I think Deernicorn has a great collection of indie games that aren't going to be as complicated as something like Dungeons and Dragons, right? Or watching streamers. This is why we've seen the huge bump in the gaming industry over the past decade, is because of people like Critical Role, right? I'm salty against Critical Role, but also they did a lot, right? And in terms of if you in the audience are okay, I don't know how to get into games, we have a game jam on February 24th where Michael and I and some really wonderful students, some of whom are in the audience, are going to be helping to run a game jam based off of climate justice. So it's making your own game themed along climate justice. There'll be a lecture, there'll be facilitation. Also with the TGA Summit that Ross mentioned, there's going to be a new designer showcase and mentorship program that if you have a game that you've been working on, I suggest submitting to this, even if it's not the most polished thing, right? Because this gives new designers a chance to showcase their material and some of them a chance to have a 6-month mentorship to work on a portfolio. So these are some of the specific opportunities that are coming up. But broadly, I think, trying to find communities, watching videos can be a good, for the socially anxious among us, a good way to learn. I think that answers the question.
Honestly, I think that was a great
that covered it so well. I was going to mention podcasts and actual plays are like such a popular way for people to get into it. You covered it well.
Yeah. One thing I'll throw in there too that I just learned about in the last year, I think from Ross and Sam, is there are solo tabletop role-playing games, which are very much like kind of interactive journaling and such, and then there's some that like allow you for you to do that solo or with a group and stuff. So that might be a good system as well to explore. Here, we'll do I think maybe 2 more questions.
I was actually just going to speak to this as well. It reminded me of when I tried joining meetups as a runner, and all the runners are really fast, and then there would always be people at the end by ourselves, and there was a woman who created a slow runner, or it was technically slow AF runner, and so like all the people that were also feeling isolated were able to find each other, and like creating community based off of like feeling othered can also be really helpful.
Yeah.
And I bet that like something about Olympia that I found interesting too is that it's so small and there's not as many people. So I've heard a lot of complaints like X event isn't available, or like this sort of thing isn't here, and like creating your own thing, like creating your own community or starting it with other people who are also feeling other can be really useful. So.
Yeah, I think some of the barriers that people encounter in trying to make things happen in places where a lot of stuff is going on don't actually exist here. For example, parking is free on the weekend. Just there's a lot of places that are looking to host events, like Altitude 15, for example. The way I got our story game nights happening again, I just walked in and it was like, hey, can I have Monday nights forever? And she was like, sure. And it's I don't know. The barrier of entry with with creating community is as low as just starting a text chain, or as low as like being willing to be a person that's going to bottom line showing up at a particular time. One thing I will say, one thing that kills community is scheduling. So like my secret sauce, one hot tip for y'all is just like pick a night. Pick a regular cadence, and this is going to be like first Mondays, or it's going to be first and third Mondays, or it's going to be every Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and people ask you, and it's just and forever. I'm always going to be there if you show up. Invite way more people than you want to come, and it takes like 3 months for that to kind of like settle in people's imaginations and for them to start building their lifestyle around that. But that's how you build community. It's just set a cadence. Dig your heels in and just show up, and be that person that's willing to hold down that space.
I'm going to choose to take this as a personal attack that I haven't shown up to a Tuesday game night that Ross has invited me to. The actual thing I wanted to say.
Tuesdays again. Yeah, stay on that Discord.
The actual thing I wanted to say is that if you're here at Evergreen or an Evergreen alum and are really interested in professional game design, I have started a Evergreen Game Designers Discord to specifically send out events and resources in a consolidated way. So if you want access to that, just email me at sam.saltiel, that's SALTIEL @evergreen.edu, because I want to make sure to share resources and make it as welcoming of a community as possible.
I just wanted to add to what Ross said, that learning to wrangle people and also speak to a group of friends is an incredible training for the skill sets that go into organizing.
Yeah, for sure. The real skill.
And one thing I want to add too is there's a lot of people that should be in this room that aren't here right now that actually don't realize that the game industry is a place they should be looking for work, because the creative economy is really hot in Washington State right now in general, and like the lawmakers and the Department of Commerce are realizing this is a really important part of who we are. And like illustrators, writers, poets. I studied poetry primarily at Evergreen, and it's actually my skills like found a home in the tabletop role playing game world. And there's a lot of folks like those friends that you have that draw and that illustrate. I mean, this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or whenever it is that they're actually looking for work, most of the hiring's happening there, and most of the opportunities are happening in the games industry. So make sure let people know.
Let's see. With that, I want to be respectful of our student media services, which also I'd love to do a huge round of thank you to all of them, the folks here and
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. And I guess a final round of applause is too for our speakers and such. Thank you guys so much for all coming out here and traveling from various distances and such. I really appreciate it. And hopefully, I think I'll see you at D&D tonight. Hopefully.
All right.
Yeah.
Those Tuesday nights.
Oh, it's Tuesday night. Okay, we're back to Tuesdays. Okay, never mind. Next week. All right.
Quick question.
Yeah.
We're part of the MES, the Environmental Studies Master's Program, and we're looking for more social science guest lectures. I'm volunteering our professors. We have not talked about this today. I would love to talk to y'all about speaking in our class.
Awesome. Wonderful.
With approval, obviously, from our people.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Show up. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. Just start raising your hands like, who are they? Yeah. All right, well, thank you all so much, and thanks to the folks online and in the future. So, all right, have a wonderful night, day.